Welcome back, and welcome to our second panel of the day, Black Sound, which will be moderated. I still hear a lot of black sound coming from out there. Hopefully that'll change quickly. Will be moderated by Dr. Victoria Grubbs, Natanis Grubbs, okay, who is a postdoctoral fellow with the Black Studies Collaboratory.
Thank you. Okay, this is exciting. The first panel really set the bar, so we're going to try and match that energy. I'm really geeked to be sitting here with these brilliant students who are going to share their really exciting projects with you. We're going to just go straight down the line and jump into it so we can hear from everyone. So first will be Brenda Umutoniwase, who's a second-year master's student in the folklore program, which is housed in the anthropology department. And Brenda will be sharing their project, Listening to Archives, an Anti-Colonial Approach to the Study of Black Folklore. So please welcome Brenda.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. I'm really grateful for being here. Yes, I am really grateful for being here and for your being here. I think I first want to kind of foreground where this project came from. I think for me, this project started out of a frustration and a realization of lack of tools, lack of language through which to discuss Black life and Black conditions in Rwanda, which is where I'm from. And I think for me, that was part of the consistent under-theorization of race and Blackness in places outside of the Black Atlantic and beyond, or spaces that have no direct or immediate connection to the events of the Middle Passage. Yet the conditions of anti-Blackness, anti-Black violence are present there as they are everywhere else. So for me, that is where this project kind of was born out of. And so through that, then I was interested to look at how we can come to understand Blackness in the Rwandan context by thinking with and against archives of culture, and that is their form, formation, and use through an alternative listening practice. And for me, that is coming from the understanding that archives in their form, which again insists on materiality, is not equipped to hold some of the most critical forms through which we come to be intelligible to ourselves, especially in a culture that is heavily animated by orality and sonicity. So throughout the summer for 2 months, I was in Rwanda working with a group of folk dancers, singers, and potters, by paying attention to events, conversations, performances. So through this, I was exploring how the sensory can help us rethink the archive in a way that goes beyond and against materiality for me. And in particular, I'm paying attention to sound, how sound as a multi-sensory phenomenon, as a means and mode of relation, as a linguistic, that's not necessarily always language, can help us develop a new complicated relationship to the archive. So in there, I was interested in developing a listening practice that kind of relies on that sound, that relies on the capaciousness of sound, a sound as a transmorphic thing that is able to transport us from one site of knowing into another. So in there then, I was relying a lot, again, in paying attention to different sounds that are produced by these folk artists, dancers, and potters, and how these sounds are signified in their production. And in here, I was hoping that we could be able to get alternative ways of looking at Black life, alternative ways of listening at Black life, that could help us complicate or understand, theorize Blackness in the context of Rwanda. And I want to emphasize that for me in here, I'm interested in sound as expansive. So I was looking at sound that manifests as, again, spoken word, sound as a as a clapping of hands, sound as a rhythm, sound different forms of sound that exist both as excess and silence, and with the understanding that this signification process is always and always structured around race, class, and gender. So in this, then, I'm hoping that we are able to develop this listening practice that relies on sound as a way that thinks about the body as a whole, not just parts, as a site of knowing, which I think for me is always oppositional to Western and imperial forms of knowing and archiving. So I think I had prepared a short video to kind of like help you see what I was paying attention to visually and sonically as well.
abavandimwe barashonje dore muhaguruke mutabara yemwe bajyaga twishima none tuhaza ibijumba byacu amasafuriya araza none amajerekani none yemwe bakomanganzo mwe mbese ubundi muragana hehe rwose mure mwijemeye mumvugire gatoya none mureke tuhaze ibumba ryaraguye we yaba ritesha agaciro kajya gatubundi bibi bama amata y'inka zacu ye tukayanywa tukishima.
Yes, so to kind of conclude on this, so I was really interested in looking at sound, this formation of sound as a chaotic production, not just focusing on one aspect of sound by the combination of it, and how through this listening practice we may be able to understand or theorize Blackness otherwise. So thank you so much.
Told y'all it was going to be exciting. Okay, thank you, Brenda. Next, we have Francesca Araújo. She's going to share her project. She's a graduate student in the African American Studies department. And her project is called Spanish Afro-Caribbean Discourse, Multimodal and Cross-Temporal Histories Through Sound. So please welcome Francesca.
I have my notes, so I'm just going to read from them because that's easier for me. So first, I'll just read the initial description of my project, which was, in this project, I listened to and labor with the theorizing done within Afro-Caribbean music genres and productions from the Spanish Caribbean, specifically dembow from the Dominican Republic, Cuban salsa, and Puerto Rican reggaeton. Grappling with articulations of geography and subjectivity articulated in particular songs of these genres, I use a cross-temporal approach to consider if music is a viable vehicle through which the Spanish Caribbean can be drafted into a broader Caribbeanist intellectual and communal history, specifically captured by Glissant and C.L.R. James. By considering what our Caribbeanist futurity can offer us, I reject the nationalizing and erasure-ridden narratives of Latinidad that attach themselves to Black genres of the Spanish Caribbean. That QR code is for a playlist on Spotify, so if you have Spotify, you can scan it and later listen to some of the songs that were accompanying me while I was thinking about this. So in one of Edouard Glissant's essays in Caribbean Discourse, he talks about the problematics of Caribbeanness, and he says that they're not part of an intellectual exercise, but to be shared collectively. not tied to the elaboration of a doctrine, but the product of a common dream, and not related to us, that is, intellectuals or scholars primarily, but to our peoples before everything else. So that sentiment was what was anchoring me throughout this project, but a little bit after that, he says, the Spanish-speaking Caribbean, and in particular Cuba, is completely turned towards Latin America, believing in the intensity of the revolutionary struggle on that continent and skeptical about the potential of the small islands of the Caribbean. And I took that personally. And in a sense, he is right. Like, in terms of a nation-state's discourse, the Spanish Caribbean islands are really turned towards Latin America. But I was wondering if that would look different if we focused on people and communities, and if we thought about culture as belonging to communities and not to nation-states. What would that tell us? Would the story still be the same? Or would there be some kind of avenue for a Caribbeanist collectivity that joins the Spanish Caribbean with the Francophone and Anglophone Caribbean despite language barriers, which is something that C.L.R. James dreamt about in his latter stages of thinking about a Caribbean nationality. So I'll talk a little bit about what specific theorists I was thinking about in terms of Caribbeanness versus Latinidad. So first, that's one of Lilia Gonzalez's articles, an Afro-Brazilian feminist, about the similarities between other Black geographies and Brazil. And in this article, she talks about how similarities can be identified specifically if you're attentive to music and forms of dancing. And she goes on to say that Black productions are obfuscated through the national language of, quote, popular culture or, quote, national folklore, which minimizes the importance of Blackness in the creation of a lot of music genres. And she says that national culture is actually a conglomerate of Black productions, but because of national narratives of racial mixture and collective ownership, the racism that comes along with this is directed specifically at people who are visual flesh symbols of Blackness, so Black people, even though the whole nation lays a claim and a collective stake in the cultures that come from Black people. And then I was also thinking about a lot about Tatiana Flores's article, where she elaborates on Alan Peláez López's creation of the hashtag Latinidad is canceled, which received a lot of backlash. So that's why this article came out. And in this article, she says, this is a direct quote, even though it is a purportedly geographic region, it does not actually exist, that is Latin America, on any map. Rather, Latin America is a meta-geography that has been described as, quote, not logically constituted. I would argue that it is constituted so as to exclude spaces where the majority of the population are Black. That is why contiguous territories like Guyana, Venezuela, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic, and Belize occupy different conceptual regions. Latinidad is a fantasy, a fabricated geopolitical identity that contains yet erases the realities of colonialism and erases Black and Indigenous people. So I think you can really see this operating with the mainstream rise of reggaeton currently, which, if you want to hear more about, you can listen to this podcast by Catalina Cleston. The podcast is called Perreo 101, and she also has this website. It's called Reggaeton con la Gata. It's a great podcast, but I think we can really see this happening with the hashtag popularized by the white Colombian artist J Balvin, which is Latino Gang, or the fact that in Bad Bunny's new album, Un Verano Sin Ti, he says, quote, todos quieren ser Latino, after shouting out Tego Calderón, one of the fathers of Puerto Rican reggaeton, specifically sandungueo, who identified himself in a very distinct manner from that kind of articulation, which I can capture with the quote, desde la cuna orgulloso de esta negrura, which means from the crib, proud of this Blackness. So how could Bad Bunny shout out this kind of artist and also make half of his album explicitly Dominican, from genres to like Dominican dictions, and really claim it, like, to put it casually, he really shows a lot of love to DR, but not say todos quieren ser caribeños instead of todos quieren ser Latino. So what I'm trying to get at in this question is that the cultures that are seen as hot and in vogue right now, in terms of Latinidad, are actually really specifically Caribbean, but their mainstream treatment is widened and collectivized. And this collectivization always seems to place primacy on non-Black and non-Caribbean Latinos. Okay, so then I'll move on to what I wanted to do with this project specifically. So I thought with 70s and 80s salsa and reggaeton as a trajectory, so reggae en español in Panama, which happened with West Indian migration, specifically with Jamaican migration, when people were going to go work on the canal. Perreo, sandungueo, all of these things I'm classifying as reggaeton in trajectory and in evolution and in movement. Dembow and rap in DR as well. So I thought about these categories in distinct ways, some lyrically, through a literary analysis, and through the knowledge that, like Barbara Christian says, these words are doing their own theorizing themselves before we project something onto them. But then I also thought about them instrumentally and what the instrumentalization in the music says about the geographic entanglements between the Spanish Caribbean and the West Indies, especially with dembow in DR and reggaeton and sandungueo in Puerto Rico. And yeah, I feel like I'm running low on time. But what I was hoping to do, and I'm still working on materially, is create what I'm calling a sonic collage, which is basically just like a DJ mix that includes some oral histories that I conducted and some of the songs that I centered in this project. Yeah, and then, yeah, that's it. I guess some very specific examples that I think would be helpful for people to look into from Catalina Eccleston's podcast is this episode called Reggaeton versus Reggaeton, where she talks about how contentious it is about who invented reggaeton, Panamanians or Puerto Ricans. And I'm not really interested in finding an answer to that question, but I think that the question itself really showcases how much Caribbean entanglements there are between the West Indies and the Spanish Caribbean, and how this is a story that can really be told through a Caribbean analytic, and so much gets lost with a Latinx analytic in a very anti-Black manner. Yeah, so that's all I'll say for now.
Thank you, Francesca. That was awesome. So our last and third panelist is Sibhale Ndwayana. Wait, let me say it right. Ndwayana, is that correct? Ndwayana, okay. Who is a graduate student in the geography department and is going to share their project with us, Between Blackness and Africanness, Listening for Afro-Diasporic Rhythms. So please welcome Sibhale.
Cool. Hello, is that okay? Cool. Hi, everyone. So my project, over the summer, I spent time doing my project. And so I came into the geography department trying to rethink how to engage with Blackness from a sonic oral practice instead of a visual practice, because I was in anthropology before, and so I had this critique of how people engage with Africa visually is problematic. And so what would it mean to rethink how we engage with the continent and spaces on the continent and Afro-diasporic spaces through a sonic lens? And so my project is sort of a work in progress, so it's messy. At times it looks really ugly. And so today I'm presenting a soundbite of it's just a soundbite, just as a provocation just as a provocation, and then I'll just speak more afterwards as well. Cool. Cool. So, yeah, so part of what the Black Studies Collaborative funding actually allowed me to do was be able to go to Cabo Verde and be able to record part of these sort of sounds and be able to sort of think how then do I, as someone who's not from there, who's from South Africa, that first engages with this space and tries to think, how do I think about the production of blackness in a space that I know nothing about as yet, but think about it through an engagement with the ear, but beyond the ear of thinking, trying to think of how do I sort of dislocate the sort of ways in which we try to listen to places, listen through the body, listen through different sensorial ways. And I think the funny thing is, I was speaking to Brenda and Francesca before all of this, and so these are part of the conversations that I've been trying to have in terms of how do we think about geospatial representation and geospatial productions through a sonic oral practice. And I think throughout the summer, I've been thinking about this and trying to think, how do I sort of engage in a practice that allows me to be able to speak about this, allows me to invite others in to be able to speak about what do you hear and what do you sort of get from that, and what sort of imaginaries come to your mind when you hear these sort of things. And so over the summer, I was really privileged to be in conversation with many people that have helped me come to these ideas. And a lot of them have been about thinking, just thinking about how then do we have a practice, a methodology to enforce sort of the theory behind it. And I think this project, this sort of soundbite, is just a way to sort of engage with that. And so my project then, from now forward, is trying to look at Cabo Verde and trying to think of how to think of blackness taken as sort of a fluid and contingent across place and time, while deconstructing Africa as a stable and animated referent that enables African diasporicness to sort of enable. So trying to think through the practices of everyday life, and not so much about the spectacular, but just the mundane that seems boring to others, but that has something there. And so because I'm also in my second year now, it's sort of enabled me to concretize the ideas that I've had and work through the ideas that I've had. And so moving forward now, I'm in a more privileged space than I was before in terms of trying to think with the project now. And so, I think I'll stop there for now. But I think there's a lot more to say about what happened and everything. And I think what I do want to say is that what I'm trying to do as well is sort of think of how to sonically remap the Black Atlantic in a way that engages with Africa and not just sort of leaves it in the background, sort of temporally leaves it in the background. And I think that's the bigger project of trying to think sonically remapping the Black Atlantic, sonically remapping engagements with Africa, but specifically through Cabo Verde, through the Lusophone, through a Lusophone engagement that encompasses circulation. And so that was why the title of that was sort of In Between Blackness, Listening for Rhythms. So that was the project.
Okay, so let's get into it a little bit. I'm really excited about this conversation, and you set us up really well for the question I was going to ask anyway, which is a beloved question around method and what I'm hearing all of you had the opportunity to do with your grants is travel, is take your body to a new space, in a new environment, and to engage with intention as a listener. So I'm really curious just to hear you guys talk about that intentionality behind listening, how it's developing for you as a research method, but also how you're drawing on older, more lifelong skills around orientation and relationality. And so if you could just talk to us a little bit about how listening helps you to rethink connections, because I think that's what you're all doing in your theorizing of Blackness, and what that feels like. That's kind of a big question, but I trust y'all. Who wants to go first?
I can go.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so before I started this project, I was really struggling with getting something that helps me talk about the affective memory, and how that can be kind of like brought to the surface, and help us think about anything, think about Blackness, think about, again, connection, think about anything, because I feel like consistently there was no space for that in the academy. And I think what this project allowed me to do was kind of go back to what was familiar to me. I always say that I came into knowledge through listening, and I kind of went back to that. And this project allowed me to kind of go back. I was really relying on the Rwandan episteme that acknowledges listening as a non-singular practice, as a practice that requires combination of senses always, and that happens at multiple sites of knowing in the body, creating an archive of its own, if I may say it that way. So for me, it was kind of playing around with how in itself what I can see transforms into something else, maybe transforms into a feeling, transforms into something I hear. So just this combination of senses through this practice of listening. Yeah, so I think I'll leave it at that.
That's a great question. I'm not really sure how to answer in a coherent way right now, but it just made me think about how my earliest memories of feeling like it was really special to be Black was listening to salsa with my family since I was 3 years old. And I'm also not from the West Coast. I'm from the East Coast. And so when I moved here, I felt like the discourses around all of these things that felt like they were little parts of my body were so like discombobulated, like they just were not aligning with how I grew up thinking about them. But something that Sib said that I think is really dope is thinking about the mundane outside of like exceptional moments and why that's so important. And I think that's one of the reasons I wanted to focus on like popular Bajo Mundo music, not like the folkloric kinds of music that are very readily associated with Blackness, like Palo in DR, or Bomba in Puerto Rico, or Rumba in Cuba. Like it's way easier for those nation states and for non-Black Latinos to say that those things are Black. But for some reason, when it comes to music that's more attached to pop culture, everything becomes way more muddy for everyone. And so in terms of listening practices, I also, because of this grant, got to go to Cuba and DR this summer. And it was just really beautiful to listen to what the foundational soul is of all of the evolutions of reggaeton and of dembow, which are Jamaican rhythms from the early and late 90s. And there's 5 really big ones. There's a Ponda rhythm, there's a Sikh rhythm. There are all of these literal Jamaican bases to these songs. And no matter what the language is that's being articulated in the songs, even if it's #Latino gang or whatever is being said, none of these genres could have existed without that West Indian migration to Panama. Yeah, and I feel like that was really special for me. And I feel like one great example is when reggaeton started emerging in Puerto Rico. One of the people who really made it distinctly Puerto Rican was Tego Calderon. And the way he did that was by integrating bomba into reggaeton, which made it sandungueo. And bomba is a really specific percussion and dance culture that's Afro-Puerto Rican. And that's when Puerto Rico really developed its own like specific strain of reggaeton that was separate from reggae en español. So even in that like small historical glimmer, there's just so much outside of the lyrics. Like which percussion instruments are being used? Are they congos? Are they tamboras? Which Jamaican rhythm can you identify in the background? And what was the first song that was made with it?
Yeah, I think for me, it's trying to think beyond the music itself as well and think about sound. Because the music is sort of very spectacular. It's easy to sort of engage. And I think the idea of sort of sound and place is important in thinking about how do people make place. And so I think in terms of methodology, then listening was a huge part of that, in terms of just being in a space and being able to listen. And I think I was always thinking about like, what am I recording with? And here, the sounds that I recorded with through my camera's Rode mic, which is like with a dead cat. It's like the thing just like so that wind doesn't sort of interrupt the sound. But also part of that is like, well, I also want to capture the sound as well. And so there are moments in which you try to capture so much that you're able to hear, and then what comes out of a speaker then as well is then what you all hear is like through this just one speaker, but the sound is actually very much stereo. And so you would have been hearing things from different sides as well. And so there's a way in which to play around with listening as well, and play around with the body and sort of feel some of the bass through the sound as well. And so there's ways in which to engage with listening that is just beyond sort of hearing a lyric that you're familiar with. I think there's also, I think with the sound that I'll speak to the sound that I'd done with just teasing a bit of sounds that some people might be familiar with as well, sort of like that FKJ and Masejo song sort of coming through. And then if you're familiar with Cabo Verde, then you'd have heard Ila de Santiago, which you know is from Cisaria Voria, and so you'd place that to Praia. And so there are different ways of listening, and the ways that in which I think the project then you sort of put out, or the way that I'm trying to think about it, sort of the project that you put out is also a way in which you want people to listen and sort of engage with that. And so it's an invitation to listen together. So I think listening for me is sort of a communal thing as well. And so that's where I found it to be really productive for me in terms of thinking, how do I invite others in to think with me and not just be sort of this person that's just recording sounds around places, but be sort of this person that's engaged with other people, trying to listen in together, and because we all hear differently. So I think that's one thing to consider. Yeah.
I'm learning a lot just listening to you guys, and thinking a lot. So there's a through line in this idea of collectivity. You're being drawn to listening as a way to access collectivity and a way to sort of gain more information about how we are together, ways of being together, what it means to be together. And so I think I would love to hear you speak on how these sounds have relations to the so-called individual body, and then that body to the collective body. All of these sounds that we've heard that you've shared with us have illicit movement, right? Like illicit dances, illicit ways of responding that is a shared knowledge. So if you guys could just talk a little bit about how that relationship between the individual body, the collective, and listening. Yeah.
I can begin.
I think that's a really great question.
Yeah, so I think I can refer to the video that I put there. It's a really good, I think it's a good visual to help us, at least, help us talk about that for me. When someone started singing or started speaking or drumming, I think what it was attracted to, or what I was kind of like drawn to, was how everybody in the group was reacting differently. There's someone who was reacting, dancing. Someone started making things. Someone started drumming. So there was different reactions to a similar sound. They're hearing the same thing, but they're experiencing it differently. And for me, this kind of combination of what's happening, what I would like to call chaos, what I was calling chaos before, I feel like is where the meat lies, is where the flesh is where we may come, I think, to understand, again, the collectivity and the individual, how they're both co-producing each other.
Yeah, and I also just, from what you're saying, just made me think of sort of the intimacies of those spaces, of the individual and the collective as well. And sort of even within the collective, there's still sort of intimacies that are shared between individuals. And I think for me, when I was in Cape Verde, because I'm not from there, so when I was there, there was this collectiveness that I felt like I was part of by just listening, by just going to, say, like, because I was on a street, like one of the main streets in Plateau, and so they had like some parties there that are just an everyday thing. And so just listening in on there and sort of what I was hearing, what everyone else was hearing, the different intimacies that sort of are shared in between those spaces. And I think that sort of alerts me to those intimacies, some of them that I might not know about, but I know that they're definitely present because I have those experiences when I hear South African music, for example, or hear something that I feel is South African. And so there's that intimacy that's sort of shared, but also collective in some way. So there are ways in which it sort of plays out or sort of moves in between those spaces together. So that's sort of how I'm trying to think with it as well, but also I think it's sort of a relational thing as well, that sort of when you hear certain sounds, it makes you think of something else as well, and sort of makes you be part of another collective that might also think of those same sounds as well. So there's elements to those, that I'm thinking of at least,
I feel like, to me, when I think about individual bodies and collective movement with my project specifically, I think about how the three genres that I focus on are really unlinkable from party, like nightlife. And I think that pleasure and happiness and joy in nightlife is just as sacred and just as important as discussing like Black grief and sufferation and those kinds of things. I really do think it's just as important, and I'm not sure if I would agree that music is easy to engage, just because, for example, one of the people that I really focus on and have been focusing on for a while is Tokisha, who's a rapper from the DR who makes dembow music, which she characterizes as playero music, which makes a connection to Jamaica and Panama. And she has literally received death threats for her music and is constantly having to make public apologies to the Dominican state for her music. And so I guess what I'm trying to get is that these genres are really perverse and disgusting to a lot of people. Every Sunday in my grandma's neighborhood, which I stayed for a while in during the summer, and I won't name because I don't think I want anthropologists going there. Every Sunday there's a teteo, and it goes from 12 a.m. to 7 in the morning. With the whole block is full, everyone's partying, and it's all quote unquote bajo mundo music, which is like dembow and perreo from Puerto Rico. And what I mean with connecting the mundane to actual music genres, even if it's literally songs, is that every single Sunday, the national police comes and throws gas bombs at everyone in their tanks. And obviously there's a lot of chaos going on. There are motorcycles, there's people screaming, there's children crying, there's grandmas yelling, but that is not the identifier that makes the cops know that they should come. Like the feather, what's the English? The cherry on top is that this very perverse music is being played. So people could be screaming and people could be loud and the police wouldn't come because that's just how it is all the time. So the responses that this music elicits is really interesting to me because it's a Catholic nation state. And what was I gonna say after that? Oh yeah, there's also, this made me think of a book, The Politics of Black Women Partying in Chicago. What's the actual title? It came out recently. You know what I'm talking about? Yes, Adeyemi. Well, in the beginning of that book, she talks about how she was at a club once, and this club was like full of a lot of non-Black people, but only Black music was being played. And it was a Black DJ, and he had like his controller, and there was a Black girl in the club, and she takes her drink and she pours it on top of his controller and ruins it. And I have never forgotten that. Like, I'm constantly thinking about that moment, because I think it's such a great reflection of like the totality of individual experiences. Like, her individual experience was just not vibing with what was happening in the room whatsoever. And yeah, so I don't know if that's a coherent response, but those are my thoughts.
Y'all, the time went really fast, but I will accept one question from Tiana. Oh, anyone? Tiana.
Thank you for this amazing panel. Oh my gosh. Like, my mind is just like doing this. I think in addition to kind of thinking about all the complex ways you're thinking about sound, what I'm inspired by is that like there are like some age-old dead debates arguably around like what is the Black Atlantic and what constitutes the African diaspora that I have before right now been tired of hearing about. And I think you guys give us new language and new experiences and new ways of knowing to kind of think about those questions in a different way, centering, of course, like not elites, centering people who aren't necessarily articulating with words that connection, right? And at the same time, I'm really curious, just as people who are navigating in these spaces and listening to these sounds that you have like so beautifully curated and brought to us, like how you think about the people who are making those sounds and what they're doing, and how to kind of think about that kind of duality of like analyzing the sounds yourself and then how they might analyze those sounds too. So I just wanted to hear a little bit if you guys have thought about that and how to do that. Thank you.
I'll go first. Yeah, for me, I think, as I said earlier, like it's sort of a communal practice for me of listening with others more than just listening as the ethnographer or the researcher. I think it's sort of an invitation to get to know what others hear and through their practice, especially those that are the practitioners of, or sort of the creators of these sounds, and thinking with how do they imagine themselves. As much as I might have questions, my own questions, they have their own questions too. And so it's engaging with that. And so it's sort of creating that space to be able to sort of come together and rethink what we're trying to do together in some ways. And I think that opens up a different space to how the project then might look at the end. So it might not be a traditional looking PhD project, or it might not even, it doesn't really have to be a PhD project in the end. It might be some sort of other format. It might come out in a different format that still engages the questions that I might still have. And so I think it's always a question of methodology that pushes you beyond sort of being the sole researcher and sort of being the sole intellect in that space. And I think that's what it sort of opens up when you start thinking about the everyday and the mundane, that there are sort of other intellects and other intelligences that are beyond sort of what we learn here at Berkeley about Africa, about these different spaces. And so it's a different engagement. It's a different way of trying to get into that space, but also knowing the history of how people have done it before in terms of engaging with those spaces, and sort of the ethnocentric ways in which people have engaged those spaces, and sort of the different gazes that people have sort of engaged with those. So for me, particularly going against the visual is trying to rethink then, how do we communally engage together, and how do we listen together? Yeah.
This is a nice background. I think about that all the time, and it's one of my largest anxieties in terms of writing about music. And at least for my project, those two things are very different. Like what I'm saying this music is doing could be the literal opposite of what these artists saying the music is doing. But I'll stay on Tokisha because I could talk about this for 50 hours. But Tokisha, for example, is a very contentious figure. Like, is she someone who considers herself a radical Black feminist? Probably not. Like, is she like thinking about all of the things she's doing in these theoretical ways that people are writing pieces about? Highly unlikely. Is she an incredibly smart individual who like knows the history of Perreo and Panamanian reggae en español and like literally calls herself like a playera artist? Yes. And also, is there value in thinking about what her work does, even if she isn't thinking of it that way? Like, how is the Dominican state responding to her music? Regardless if she says she's a feminist or not, regardless if she says that she's queer or not, like, how is the Dominican state coding her, and what does that tell us about what's being articulated, regardless of how she's defining it? So I think, like, methodologically, some really intense attentiveness to those material outcomes can be a way to not get around that, because I always think it's important to acknowledge that, like, this is not what I'm saying Tokisha's saying, this is what I'm saying her figure's doing in the state, and what that tells us about Dominican history in general in terms of how excess has to be contained. And if this is excess that has to be contained, how does that relate to Blackness, which has been excess in the Dominican state forever?
Yeah, for me, this is really, really challenging. And I'm hoping to continue looking at it, hopefully through my PhD program. But specifically with the group that I'm working with, this is a group, again, to give you context, this is a group that does singing and dancing and pottery as for survival as well. So there are economic kind of like conditions at stake all the time for me. And in thinking about what this sound does or what this sound means for them, it's really challenging to think about it or think beyond capitalist logics of survival, or without me imposing my own understanding of Blackness or Black life onto them. So it's always a challenge, kind of thinking together and listening together in what this means for them, and what this could mean for all of us. And I'm hoping to continue doing that. So.
Okay, y'all, we're out of time, but can you help me make some noise for this wonderful work? Bow, 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 bow. Thanks so much. Great job, guys.